You are not what I expected. Clara Whitmore stood frozen on the empty platform, suitcase in hand, listening to the man she'd crossed a continent to marry tell her the wedding was off before she'd even set her bag down. Abandoned, humiliated, alone in a town that owed her nothing. The crowd had already started to whisper, already started to turn away until one cowboy refused to. "Don't let that man convince you you're worthless," he said. And everything about to happen to Clara Whitmore was about to change forever. Before you find out what he did next, hit subscribe and drop your city below, so I can see how far this story has traveled. The whistle screamed one last time, and then the train was gone, swallowed by the flat gold distance of the Wyoming plains, and Clara Whitmore stood on the platform with her suitcase in one hand and a letter in the other. And for the first time in 3 months, she had absolutely nowhere left to look but forward. She smoothed the front of her traveling dress. She had worn her best one, the pale blue one, with the collar she'd stitched herself because a woman only got one chance to be seen for the first time, and she wanted him to see someone worth keeping. She read the letter again, though she had memorized every line of it weeks ago. "I am a man of my word, Miss Whitmore. You will not regret coming west. Nathan Cole." She folded it carefully and slid it into her coat pocket, right over her heart, like it was something that could protect her. The platform was busier when the train had first pulled in. A family had been reunited in tears near the ticket window. 2 men in suits had shaken hands and walked off toward town, already talking business. A boy had run past her twice chasing a dog. But now, 10 minutes later, the crowd had thinned to nothing, and Clara realized she was the only person left standing there. She told herself it was fine. "He's a busy man," she whispered to no one. "A rancher can't always know exactly when a train comes in." 20 minutes passed. The station agent, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, stepped out of his little office and began pulling the shutters closed. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, "you got someone coming for you." "Yes," Clara said quickly. "Nathan Cole. He owns a ranch outside of town." Something crossed this man's face. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition, the kind that came with things left unsaid. "You wait right there," he said. "I'll leave the lamp lit a while longer." That was not comforting. That was the opposite of comforting, and Clara felt it settle in her stomach like a stone. 30 minutes. 40. The sun began sliding lower, painting the platform boards in long orange stripes, and Clara sat down on her suitcase because her legs had started to shake, and she didn't want anyone walking by to see a grown woman trembling like a child. "He is coming," she told herself. "He wrote to me every week for 3 months. A man doesn't do that, and then simply not show up." She thought of the letters. Dozens of them. She could still recite pieces of them the way some women recited scripture. "I built this ranch with my own hands, Miss Whitmore, and I mean to build a home to go with it. I believe a woman with your character is exactly what that home is missing." She had read that line so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold. A carriage turned onto the road that led toward the station, and Clara's whole body went rigid with hope. There he is. She stood so fast, she nearly knocked her suitcase over. She pressed her palms down her skirt, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and made herself smile, even though her chest was pounding so hard she thought the man might hear it before he even reached her. The carriage rolled to a stop at the edge of the platform. A man stepped down. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a fine dark coat that had clearly never seen a day of ranch work in its life. His boots were polished. His hat sat at a careful, deliberate angle. He looked, Clara thought in that first instant, exactly like a man who wrote confident letters. "Mr. Cole," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. The man's eyes moved over her. Not into her eyes. Over her. Down and then up the way a buyer looked over a horse he was deciding whether to bid on. "You're Clara Whitmore," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." She held out her hand the way she had practiced in her mind 100 times on the train. "It's a great honor to finally—" He didn't take her hand. "You're not what I expected," he said. The words hit her like ice water. For a moment Clara thought she had misheard him. I'm sorry. Nathan Cole's mouth pulled into something that wasn't quite a frown and wasn't quite a sneer. It was worse than either. Your letters made you sound... He paused, searching for the word like he was choosing a purchase at a market stall. Refined. You look like you've spent your whole life in a sewing room. I have spent time in sewing rooms, Clara said, and she felt something rise in her chest that was equal parts humiliation and anger. I told you that in my very first letter, Mr. Cole. I was never anything but honest with you. Honest, he repeated, like the word tasted bad. He circled her slowly, the way he might circle a mare he was inspecting for flaws, and Clara stood frozen, too stunned to move, too proud to run. I have men on my ranch, Nathan said. I have a reputation in this town. I need a wife who can sit at the head of my table when the bankmen come to dinner. I need a wife who looks like she belongs in a parlor, not... He gestured vaguely at her dress. Not like this. This is my best dress, Clara said, and hated how small her voice sounded. I can see that, Nathan said. That's the problem. Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides. You wrote me 41 letters, she said. I counted them, Mr. Cole. 41 letters telling me you wanted a partner, not a decoration. I changed my mind. The words were so simple, so careless, like he was telling her he'd decided against a particular fabric for his curtains. You cannot simply change your mind, Clara said, and now her voice shook with something closer to fury than grief. I sold nearly everything I owned to make this journey. I have no home to go back to. I have no family waiting for me anywhere on this earth. You asked me to come here. You promised me a home. For just a moment, one single moment, something like guilt flickered behind Nathan Cole's eyes. And then it was gone, replaced by cold, practiced indifference. The arrangement is over, Miss Whitmore, he said. I'm sorry for your trouble, truly, but that is not my problem to solve. He turned. He actually turned and began walking back toward his carriage as though she was already a matter finished and filed away. Wait. Clara's voice cracked. She hated that it cracked. Wait, please, what am I supposed to do? I don't know anyone in this town. I have $11 to my name. Nathan paused with one hand on the carriage door. There's a boarding house on 3rd Street, he said, not even turning around. Mrs. Pruitt runs it. Tell her I sent you, and maybe she'll knock a little off the price. That's your solution. Clara's voice rose, and she didn't care anymore who heard her. You bring me 2,000 miles across this country, and your solution is a boarding house. I never brought you anywhere, Nathan said coldly. You bought your own ticket. That was your choice, Miss Whitmore, not mine. And then he climbed into the carriage, and the driver snapped the reins, and the whole rig rolled away down the dirt road, kicking up dust that drifted back over the platform and settled fine and pale on the shoulders of Clara's blue dress. She stood there. She didn't know for how long. Long enough that the last of the sunset burned itself out behind the mountains, and the sky went the color of a bruise. Long enough that her arms began to ache from holding her suitcase against her chest like a shield. Long enough that the tears she'd been fighting since the moment he said, "You're not what I expected," finally broke loose, and she had to press the back of her hand against her mouth to keep from sobbing out loud in front of the handful of townsfolk who had gathered near the general store to watch the whole humiliating scene unfold. Poor thing, she heard one woman murmur to another. Mail-order bride, I'd wager, the second woman said. Cole's done this before. Sent 2 others back on the next train, far as I heard. 2 others. The words landed in Clara's chest like stones dropped into still water. He had done this before. She was not the first. She was not even special enough to be a mistake he hadn't made twice already. Should somebody help her? A young man near the store asked. Not our business, an older man said, already turning back toward the saloon. Cole's business is Cole's business. Best folks stay clear of it. Not our business. Clara lowered her head so the strangers wouldn't see the shame burning in her face. She had never in her life felt smaller than she did in that moment, standing on a strange platform, in a strange territory, watching an entire town decide in real time that her suffering wasn't worth their trouble. She thought about this boarding house. $11. She didn't know how many nights that would buy her or what she would do when it ran out, or what a woman with no family and no prospects and no home was even supposed to do in a place like this. She thought for one terrible, dizzying moment about simply sitting down on the platform and not getting up at all, and that was when she heard the voice. "Don't let that man convince you that you're worthless." Clara turned so fast she nearly stumbled. A man stood a few feet away, close enough that she wondered how long he'd been standing there watching, listening to every cruel word Nathan Cole had thrown at her. He was taller than Nathan, though not as polished. His vest was faded brown, worn soft at the seams from years of work. His boots were scuffed with real dust, not the kind for show. He had a weathered hat pushed back slightly on his head, and beneath it, a pair of steady gray eyes that were looking at her, not the way Nathan had looked at her, not sizing her up, not judging her, but simply seeing her. "I beg your pardon," Clara said, her voice still unsteady. "That man," the stranger said, nodding toward the road where Nathan's carriage had long since disappeared. "Whatever he told you back there, don't carry it. It isn't true, and it isn't yours to carry." Clara wiped hastily at her eyes, embarrassed to be caught crying by a total stranger, and lifted her chin the way she'd been taught to when she wanted the world to believe she was stronger than she felt. "You don't know what he told me," she said. "I heard most of it," the man admitted without a trace of apology. "Didn't mean to. Was loading feed sacks by the depot when he started in on you. Man's got a voice that carries when he's cruel." Heat flooded Clara's cheeks. "Then you also heard him tell the whole platform I sold everything I owned to come out here for nothing." "I did. So you understand why I don't particularly want to discuss it further with a stranger." Something almost like a smile touched the corner of the man's mouth there and gone. "Fair enough," he said. He tipped his hat slightly. "Name's Ethan Walker. I've got a place a few miles outside of town. Nothing fancy. Nothing like what Cole's got." He glanced toward the empty road again, and his jaw tightened just slightly. "But I don't leave people standing alone on a platform when the sun's going down and they've got nowhere to sleep." "I have somewhere to sleep," Clara said more sharply than she intended. "There's a boarding house. Mrs. Pruitt's place." Ethan nodded slowly. "She's a decent woman, but her rooms run $1.50 a night, and unless I misheard you, you said $11 was all you had." Clara's mouth went dry. She hadn't meant for anyone to hear that part. "That's not your concern," she said. "No." Ethan agreed easily. "It isn't. You're right about that." He didn't argue with her. He didn't push. He simply stood there patient as stone, letting the silence stretch out between them until Clara felt the fight go out of her shoulders, replaced by something far more exhausting, the simple bone-deep truth of her situation. "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted, stripped of the pride she'd been trying to hold on to. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Ethan considered the question like it deserved real thought, rather than a quick, easy answer. "Because someone should," he said at last. "And because a man who leaves a woman standing alone in a strange town after promising her a home that tells you everything about his character. It doesn't say one thing about yours." Clara's eyes stung again, and this time it had nothing to do with Nathan Cole. "I have a ranch outside town," Ethan went on. "Small operation. Cattle mostly. I've got 4 men working for me and not one of them can cook a meal that doesn't taste like burnt leather." That earned the faintest flicker of a smile from Clara, quickly suppressed. "House needs a woman's hand in it too. Been putting off fixing the kitchen for 2 years now because I don't know the first thing about it." "You're offering me work," Clara said slowly. "I'm offering you a roof, honest wages, and a place where nobody's going to look at you like you're something they ordered from a catalog and decided didn't measure up." Ethan's voice hardened just slightly on that last part, the only sign of real anger Clara had seen from him. "What you do with that offer is your business." Clara looked down the road one more time, half expecting, hoping some traitorous part of her, still hoping to see Nathan's carriage turning back. But the road stayed empty, and the last color was draining out of the sky, and somewhere behind her she heard the boarding house sign creaking faintly on its hinges. $1.50 a night. She couldn't spare more than a handful of times before her money ran out completely. "I don't know you," she said quietly. "No." Ethan agreed. "You don't. You could be worse than him." "I could be," Ethan said, and something about his honesty, the sheer unpolished bluntness of it, struck Clara harder than any reassurance could have. "I can't prove to you standing on this platform that I'm not. All I can tell you is I've got no plans to make you regret trusting me, and I'd rather you decide for yourself over time than take my word for it right now." Clara studied him for a long moment. The dust on his boots, the honest wear in his vest, the way he hadn't once looked at her, the way Nathan hadn't measured her, hadn't found her lacking. "The wages," she said. "How much?" "Fair wages," Ethan said. "We'll work out particulars once you've seen the place and decided if it suits you. I'm not looking to trap anybody into anything, Miss Whitmore," Clara said. "Clara Whitmore." "Miss Whitmore." He nodded, like filing the name away carefully. "You're free to leave any time the arrangement doesn't sit right with you. I mean that." It was such a small thing to say, such a plain, ordinary sentence. You're free to leave any time. And yet, Clara felt it land somewhere deep. Somewhere, Nathan Cole's 41 letters full of flowery promises had never once managed to reach, because every one of those letters, she realized now, had been about what he wanted, what he needed, what he was willing to accept. This man, this stranger with dust on his boots and steadiness in his voice, was the first person in longer than she could remember to offer her something without asking anything of her in return. "All right," Clara said, and her voice, though still unsteady, was stronger than it had been all evening. "All right, Mr. Walker. I'll come see your ranch." Something eased in Ethan's shoulders, though he didn't smile exactly. He simply reached for her suitcase. "I can carry that," Clara said quickly. "I know you can," Ethan said. "Doesn't mean you have to." He took it before she could argue further, and something about the ease of the gesture, no demand behind it, no expectation of gratitude, nearly undid the last of Clara's composure. They walked toward his wagon in silence for a few steps, and then Clara, unable to help herself, glanced back one more time at the empty station at the platform where she'd stood not 30 minutes ago, believing her whole future was about to begin, only to watch it crumble in front of a town full of strangers. "He said I wasn't what he expected," she said quietly, almost to herself. Ethan stopped walking. He looked at her, really looked the way he had from the very first moment, without judgment, without measuring. "Man built his whole expectation on a letter and a photograph," he said. "That's not a woman, Miss Whitmore. That's a wish list. You were never going to match it because nobody could. That's not a flaw in you. That's a flaw in wanting a person to be a fantasy instead of a person." Clara didn't know how to answer that, so she said nothing and let him load her suitcase into the back of the wagon and let him help her up onto the bench seat beside him, and told herself that whatever came next, it could not possibly be worse than what she'd already survived that day. She was wrong about that, though she wouldn't understand exactly how wrong for quite some time, because as the wagon pulled away from the station and the lights of town began to shrink behind them, a man watched from the shadow of the saloon porch. Arms crossed, jaw tight, with something that looked very much like anger. It was Nathan Cole's foreman, a lean, sharp-eyed man named Silas Grant, and he had seen everything: the rejection, the tears, and Ethan Walker stepping in to carry away the woman Nathan Cole had so publicly, so humiliatingly discarded. He turned and walked quickly toward the saloon's back room, where a lamp still burned behind a half-closed door, because there were things Nathan Cole needed to hear before the night was through, and none of them boded well for the fragile new peace Clara Whitmore had just found. The wagon rolled steadily along the dirt road, the wheels creaking in a rhythm that felt oddly like the first calm thing Clara had experienced all day. The sky had gone fully dark now, scattered with more stars than she'd ever seen back east, and for a long while, neither she nor Ethan spoke. It was Clara who finally broke the silence. "You said you have 4 men working for you," she said. "What will they think, a stranger showing up to run your kitchen?" "They'll think whatever they think," Ethan said. "Won't change how I run my ranch." That's not really an answer. The corner of his mouth twitched again, that almost smile she was beginning to realize was as close as he came to open amusement. Tommy's 16 works hard, doesn't talk much. Old Ruiz has been with me 8 years, came up from Texas, makes better coffee than anybody I've ever met, and won't admit it took him 20 years of practice. Big Frank's built like a barn door and scared of chickens for reasons nobody's ever gotten out of him. And Walt keeps to himself mostly. Ethan glanced at her sideways. None of them are going to give you trouble, Miss Whitmore. I'd have a word if they did. You sound very certain. I am. Clara studied his profile in the dim starlight, the set of his jaw, the calm authority in his voice so different from Nathan Cole's brittle performative confidence. May I ask you something personal, Mr. Walker? You can ask. Why haven't you married a man your age running his own ranch? Surely there have been women in this territory who'd have welcomed the offer. For the first time since she'd met him, something shadowed passed over Ethan's face, quick but unmistakable. Lost my parents when I was young, he said finally. Fever took them both inside a week back when I was 19. I had a ranch half built and no idea how to run it, and everybody in town figured I'd fail inside a year. His hands tightened just slightly on the reins. Took me a long while to trust that anything good could stay. Easier some years to keep to the work than to risk caring about something that might get taken away again. Clara felt something in her chest ache at that some deep recognition, because she understood more than he could possibly know, yet exactly what it meant to build your whole life around not trusting good things to last. I lost my parents too, she said quietly. I was 16. There wasn't fever, just hard winters, hard years. I went into service after that. Boarding houses, sewing rooms, wherever I could find honest work. She looked down at her hands folded tight in her lap. I told myself the mail-order arrangement was practical. A sensible decision for a woman with no family and no prospects. But if I'm honest, Mr. Walker, some part of me hoped it might be more than practical. I hoped someone might actually. She stopped herself embarrassed at how much she'd revealed to a man she'd known less than an hour. Might actually want you. Ethan finished quietly. Not just need a woman to run a household. Clara looked at him startled that he'd said the exact words she couldn't bring herself to finish. Yes, she admitted softly. Exactly that. They rode in silence again after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not awkward, not heavy with everything unsaid, but something gentler. Something that felt strangely like the beginning of understanding between two people who had both spent a very long time being disappointed by the world. The ranch came into view slowly. First the fence line catching moonlight, then the low silhouette of a modest house with a wide porch, a barn beside it, corrals holding shapes that shifted and shuffled in the dark. It was nothing like what Clara had imagined when she pictured a rancher's home. There was no grand entrance, no columns, no gleaming windows lit up with the promise of wealth. It was simple, sturdy, honest the way Ethan himself seemed to be. It's not much. Ethan said an edge of something almost like apology in his voice as he pulled the wagon to a stop. It's more than I had an hour ago, Clara said, and meant it. The front door opened before Ethan had even set the brake, and a boy Tommy Clara guessed given his age came jogging out, curiosity plain on his young face. Mr. Walker, who's... This is Miss Whitmore, Ethan said, climbing down and reaching to help Clara from the bench. She'll be staying on running the house. Fetch Ruiz and Frank, would you? Let them know we've got a guest tonight and one more mouth to feed permanent starting tomorrow. Tommy's eyes went wide with barely concealed interest, but he nodded and disappeared back inside, already calling out names into the dark house. Clara stood beside the wagon, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look. Dust on her hem, her eyes surely still red from crying, her hair coming loose from its pins after the long, wretched day. I must look a fright, she murmured. You look like a woman who had a hard day and is still standing, Ethan said simply. That's nothing to be ashamed of. The door opened again, and this time an older man stepped out, weathered silver at the temples, with the kind of steady, watchful eyes that suggested he missed very little. Behind him came a much larger man, broad as a barn door, just as Ethan had described, hanging back slightly, with an expression of open, almost boyish curiosity. "Ruiz," Ethan said. "Frank, this is Miss Clara Whitmore. She'll be taking over the kitchen starting tomorrow, and I expect every one of you to treat her with the respect she's due." Ruiz studied Clara for a long moment, and then something in his weathered face softened. "Cole leave you standing at that station?" he asked bluntly. "Heard talk in town a few weeks back he'd sent for another bride." Clara stiffened, humiliation flaring hot in her chest again. "Word travels fast, it seems." "Small town," Ruiz said, not unkindly. "Word travels the only way it knows how." He nodded slowly, like something had been confirmed that he'd already suspected. "Man's done it before. You're not the first, and knowing him likely won't be the last, though I hope for the next woman's sake she never has to find that out." "That's enough, Ruiz," Ethan said, though there was no real sharpness in it. "Just saying what's true," Ruiz said, and then to Clara's surprise he offered her the ghost of a smile. "Glad the boss had the sense to bring you here instead of leaving you to Mrs. Pruitt's cooking. Woman burns water." Despite everything, despite the humiliation, the exhaustion, the ache of the whole terrible day, Clara felt a small, unexpected laugh escape her. "I'll try to do better than burned water," she said. "Anything'll be better than what we've been eating," Frank said, speaking for the first time, his voice a low rumble that didn't match his shy, almost bashful expression. "Ruiz's stew tastes like boiled rope." "Nobody asked you, Frank," Ruiz said, but there was warmth under the gruffness. Ethan watched the exchange with something Clara hadn't seen on his face before. Not quite a smile, but close and easing of the guarded weight he seemed to carry. "Get her bag inside," he told Tommy, who had reappeared in the doorway. "Miss Whitmore's had a long day. She can settle into the back room tonight, and we'll sort the rest out come morning." As Tommy hurried to obey, Clara found herself standing on the porch steps, looking back at the dark road that had brought her here, thinking of the station, of Nathan Cole's cold, dismissive eyes, of the $11 in her coat pocket that had felt an hour ago like the last thin thread keeping her from disaster. And now here she was. A roof, a kitchen to run. People who, strange as it seemed after everything, had welcomed her without a single moment of judgment. "Miss Whitmore," Ethan's voice quiet at her shoulder. "Yes. Whatever that man said to you today," he said, "it isn't the truth of who you are, just the truth of who he is. I hope in time you'll come to see the difference." Clara looked up at him, at the steady gray eyes that had not once since the moment they met looked at her like she was something lacking. "Thank you, Mr. Walker," she said softly. "For today. For all of it." "Ethan," he said, "if you're going to be running my kitchen and putting up with Ruiz's opinions on stew, I think we can dispense with the formalities." "Ethan," Clara repeated, testing the name, and found to her quiet surprise that it felt easier on her tongue than she expected. She did not know, standing there on that porch with the Wyoming stars spread wide and cold above her, that miles away in a dim back room of the town saloon, Nathan Cole was already learning her name again, this time from the mouth of his foreman, in a voice tight with warning. "She's at Walker's place," Silas Grant said. "Whole town saw him carry her off like some kind of hero." Nathan Cole's jaw tightened, and something calculating moved behind his cold eyes, something that had nothing to do with regret over how he'd treated her, and everything to do with the fact that Ethan Walker's modest ranch sat on land Nathan Cole had wanted for the better part of 2 years. Land that ran along the creek his own cattle desperately needed water from during the dry months. Land he had already quietly begun making plans to acquire one way or another, long before Clara Whitmore had ever stepped off that train. "Let them have their little romance," Nathan said slowly, a thin, humorless smile curling at the edge of his mouth. "Won't matter much once Walker's lost the ranch out from under both of them." Silas frowned. "Boss, nothing you need worry over yet," Nathan said, turning back to the papers spread across the table in front of him. Deed surveys, a letter from a land office in Cheyenne he'd been careful to keep from prying eyes. "Just make sure Marsh has those documents ready by the end of the month. Everything else will take care of itself." Back at Walker Creek Ranch, Clara lay awake long after the house had gone quiet, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling of the small back room that was for tonight at least hers. She thought of Ethan's steady voice, of Ruiz's gruff kindness, of the strange, unexpected mercy of a day that had begun with humiliation and ended somehow with the first real safety she'd felt in longer than she could remember. She did not yet know about the papers on Nathan Cole's table, or the water rights he coveted, or the quiet patient scheme already taking shape in the dark corners of a man who had once decided she wasn't worth keeping. All she knew, as sleep finally began to pull her under, was that for the first time in months, she did not feel entirely alone. And somewhere down the hall, Ethan Walker sat awake a while longer too, staring at nothing in particular, wondering against every hard-won instinct that told him not to hope for things that could be taken away. Whether the woman sleeping under his roof tonight might turn out to be the one good thing this year had finally decided to hand him instead of take. Morning came to Walker Creek Ranch with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of a rooster that clearly believed itself far more important than it was, and Clara woke with a start, momentarily unsure where she was, before the events of the previous day came crashing back over her like a wave. She sat up quickly, smoothing her hair, listening to the sounds of a house already stirring around her boots on floorboards. Low voices, the clatter of a stove being fed. I have work to do, she thought, and the thought steadied her more than she expected. By the time she made it to the kitchen dressed and hair pinned properly, Ruiz was already standing at the stove, frowning at a pan like it had personally wronged him. "Miss Whitmore," he said, relief plain in his voice. "Tell me you know your way around a stove better than I do." "I've been cooking since I was 12, Clara said, tying an apron she found hanging by the door. "Move aside, Mr. Ruiz." "Just Ruiz," he said, stepping back gladly. "And it's not that I can't cook. It's that 4 men eating my cooking for 8 years has worn down their tolerance for suffering." Clara almost laughed, a real laugh, the first one that had come easily since before she'd boarded that train weeks ago. She surveyed the kitchen. It was serviceable but neglected in the particular way a kitchen gets neglected when the men using it care only about whether food is edible, not whether it's good. Shelves half-organized, a pantry with supplies scattered with no logic, a stove that hadn't been properly cleaned in longer than she wanted to guess. "This will take some doing," she murmured. "Ma'am?" Tommy poked his head in, eyes bright with the kind of curiosity only a 16-year-old boy could summon before 9 in the morning. "Nothing, Tommy. Just thinking aloud." Clara pulled her sleeves up. "Is there coffee?" "Ruiz makes coffee that could strip paint," Frank offered from the doorway, ducking his head slightly to fit through it. "Fair warning." "I heard that," Ruiz said. "You were meant to," Frank said, and retreated before Ruiz could respond, a small smile tugging at his massive shoulders. Clara found herself smiling too, despite everything, despite the exhaustion still sitting heavy behind her eyes from a night of restless, fractured sleep. There was an ease to this house that she hadn't expected, a warmth built not from wealth or polish, but from the plain, unadorned honesty of people who worked hard and didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. She had just started sorting through the pantry when Ethan appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the day, hat in hand. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." Clara glanced up, and something in her chest did a small, unexpected flip at the sight of him. Daylight suited him. She thought the same steady calm from the night before, now edged with the practical energy of a man about to start his workday. "I hope it's all right that I've already started reorganizing your kitchen." "It's more than all right." Ethan looked around, taking in the changes already underway, and something like surprise crossed his face. "You've done more in an hour than I've managed in 2 years. 2 years is a long time to live with a disorganized pantry," Clara said. "Man gets used to things being a certain way," Ethan admitted, "even when the way isn't good." There was something underneath the words. Clara thought something that wasn't really about the pantry at all, but before she could examine it too closely, Ethan cleared his throat and gestured toward the door. "I've got to ride the north fence line today, check on some cattle that strayed. Ruiz'll show you where everything's kept, answer whatever questions you've got. If you need anything from town, Tommy can take the wagon in." I'll manage, Clara said. Thank you, Ethan. He paused at the door, hat still in hand, and for a moment their eyes met, and something passed between them that neither one quite had words for yet. Clara. He said her first name for the first time, and it landed softer in the air than she expected. I'm glad you stayed. Then he was gone, boots on the porch steps, and Clara stood in the kitchen, with her heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar, before Ruiz's dry voice cut through the moment. He never talks that easy to anybody, Ruiz said, not looking up from the flour he was measuring badly. Just so you know. I don't know what you mean, Clara said, cheeks warming. Sure you don't, Ruiz said, and there was nothing but kindness in the teasing. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Clara hadn't realized she'd been starving for. Mornings began before the sun. Coffee and biscuits and the low murmur of men readying themselves for a day's work. Clara scrubbed the kitchen top to bottom, reorganized the pantry into something with actual logic, mended curtains that had been torn for who knew how long, and by the end of the first week, the house had begun to feel less like a bunkhouse that happened to have a kitchen and more like something approaching a home. The men noticed. Best meal I've had in years, Frank announced one evening, practically inhaling a plate of stew that bore no resemblance to Ruiz's infamous boiled rope. Don't let it go to her head, Ruiz said, though he was on his third helping. Too late, Tommy said through a mouthful of biscuit. Miss Whitmore, will you teach me to cook like this? I want to impress a girl in town. Which girl? Frank asked, delighted. Tommy went beet red. Nobody. Never mind. The table erupted into laughter, and Clara found herself laughing along with them genuinely easily, in a way that felt almost foreign after the guarded, careful years she'd spent surviving rather than living. Only Ethan stayed quieter during these moments, though Clara noticed she couldn't help but notice the way his eyes would find her across the table, the way something in his expression softened when he thought no one was watching. She was watching, though. She was watching more than she probably should have allowed herself to. It was on the 10th day that the first real crack in her fragile new peace appeared. Clara had walked into town with Tommy to buy supplies. Flour, sugar, a length of fabric for curtains she wanted to make for the front room, and she was standing outside the general store counting coins carefully into her palm when a voice behind her made her spine go rigid. Miss Whitmore, I heard you were still in the area. She turned. Nathan Cole stood a few feet away, dressed as finely as he had been at the station, an unreadable expression on his face. Mr. Cole. Her voice came out cooler than she expected, steadier than she felt. You're looking well, he said, and there was something in his tone, some careful, calculated warmth that put Clara instantly on guard. I'm surprised you'd notice, she said. Given you found me so lacking a week and a half ago. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not quite shame, more like irritation at being reminded of an inconvenient truth. I may have been hasty, he said. The arrangement was a difficult decision made in a difficult moment. I've had time to reconsider. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. Reconsider what exactly? You, Nathan said simply. Us. I think we got off on the wrong foot, Miss Whitmore, and I'd like the chance to begin again properly. Dinner, perhaps. This Friday. For a moment, Clara was too stunned to respond. The audacity of it, the sheer breathtaking audacity, nearly took her breath away. You left me standing alone on a train platform, she said slowly, each word deliberate, with $11 to my name and nowhere to sleep. You told an entire town I wasn't what you expected. And now you're asking me to dinner. I'm asking for a second chance, Nathan said, and there was an edge creeping into his voice now, the patience of a man unused to being refused. I'm a reasonable man, Miss Whitmore. I can offer you a life most women in this territory would envy. Surely that's worth more consideration than whatever Walker's scraping together on that little spread of his. The mention of Ethan's name in Nathan's mouth made something in Clara go sharp and cold. Ethan Walker has shown me more respect in 10 days than you managed in 3 months of letters and 1 afternoon in person, she said. I'll give you my answer plainly, Mr. Cole, so there's no confusion later. I am not interested. Not now. Not ever. Nathan's jaw tightened, the pleasant mask slipping just enough for Clara to see something harder underneath. That's unfortunate, he said quietly. For everyone. Is that a threat? It's an observation, Nathan said, already turning away. The world doesn't always reward stubbornness, Miss Whitmore. You might remember that. He walked off down the street, and Clara stood there, heart-hammering coins still clutched tight in her palm, watching him go with a growing sense of unease she couldn't quite name. You all right, Miss Whitmore? Tommy asked, emerging from the store with a sack of flour balanced on his shoulder. I'm fine, Clara said, though her voice shook slightly. Let's get back to the ranch. She didn't tell Ethan about the encounter that evening. She told herself it was because it wasn't worth troubling him over, because Nathan Cole's wounded pride was hardly a real threat, because she didn't want to give the man's petty cruelty any more room in her new life than it had already taken. But that night, lying awake in the dark, she couldn't shake the cold, deliberate way Nathan had said, "That's unfortunate for everyone," like a promise, not a lament. She should have said something sooner. 3 days later, Ethan came in from the fields with a look on his face Clara hadn't seen before, tight controlled the particular calm of a man working very hard to stay calm. Clara, he said, setting a folded paper on the kitchen table. Do you know anything about this? She wiped her hands on her apron and picked it up. It was a letter formal in its language from a land office in Cheyenne addressed to Ethan Walker regarding a dispute in the recorded boundary of the property known as Walker Creek Ranch. I don't understand, Clara said, reading it twice. What dispute? You've owned this land since your parents. Since my parents built it, yes, Ethan said. Filed properly, all legal, never a question raised in 15 years. His voice was tight. Until now. Who filed this? Ethan's eyes met hers, and Clara felt her stomach drop before he even said the name. Nathan Cole. The kitchen went very quiet. He's claiming, Ethan continued reading from a second paper Clara hadn't noticed, that the original survey of my father's land was flawed. That the creek boundary, the water access Clara, the thing that keeps every head of cattle on this ranch alive through summer, was never legally mine to begin with. He's filed to have it surveyed again, and if the land office rules in his favor, he stands to gain access to the very water my whole operation depends on. That's absurd, Clara said. He can't simply invent a dispute out of nothing. He can if he's got money behind him and friends in the land office, Ethan said grimly. Which, unfortunately, he does. Clara set the letter down slowly, her mind racing back to the encounter outside the general store to Nathan's cold, deliberate words. That's unfortunate, for everyone. Ethan, she said quietly, I need to tell you something. He looked at her, something wary entering his expression. What is it? I saw him. In town a few days ago. He asked me to dinner. The words came out in a rush now, guilt propelling them faster than she meant. I refused him, plainly so there'd be no confusion. And he said something before he left that the world doesn't reward stubbornness. I thought it was just wounded pride talking. I didn't think... You didn't think he'd go after my land because you turned down his dinner invitation? Ethan finished. And though his voice was even, Clara could see something coiled tight behind his eyes. I should have told you sooner, she said. I'm sorry. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, jaw working, and Clara braced herself for anger. Anger she felt she deserved for keeping something this important to herself out of pride, out of not wanting to be the cause of trouble in a home that had only just begun to feel safe. But when he finally spoke, his voice wasn't angry. It was tired, and something else beneath the tiredness, something that sounded to Clara's surprise, almost like fierce protective resolve. This isn't about you refusing his dinner invitation, Ethan said. Men like Nathan Cole don't need a real reason to go after what they want. He's wanted access to this creek for 2 years, long before you ever stepped off that train. You just gave him an excuse to move faster than he might have otherwise. That doesn't make me feel better, Clara admitted. It's not meant to make you feel better, Ethan said. It's meant to make sure you understand this isn't your fault, not one piece of it. Clara looked at him at the steady, unwavering conviction in his face, so different from the cold calculation she'd seen in Nathan's eyes just days before, and felt something in her chest tighten with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Fight it," Ethan said simply. "I've got the original deed, my father's survey records. It'll take time, and it'll take money. I don't especially have to spare on lawyers, but I'm not handing over water rights my family bled for, because a spoiled man with a grudge decided he wanted them." "I can help," Clara said immediately. "Whatever you need, I can write letters, organize documents, anything." Something in Ethan's expression eased just slightly at her words. "I know you can," he said. "That's not really in question." The weeks that followed were a strange, tense mixture of ordinary ranch life and mounting pressure from Cheyenne. Letters arrived with increasing frequency, each one more formal, more threatening in its careful legal language. Ethan spent long hours at the small kitchen table, poring over old documents by lamplight, and Clara sat across from him more nights than not, helping him organize records, drafting careful, measured responses to send back to the land office. "You have a good hand for this," Ethan said one night, watching her copy out a document in her neat, careful script. "Better than mine, certainly." "I spent years doing correspondence work in the boarding houses," Clara said. "Turns out it's good for something besides earning my keep." "It's good for a great deal, apparently." Ethan's eyes lingered on her a moment too long, and Clara felt her pulse quicken under the weight of his attention. "Ethan," she said, setting down her pen, "can I ask you something? Always. Why does this land matter so much to you? I understand. It's your family's. I understand the water rights matter for the cattle. But there's something else in the way you talk about it. Something deeper." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the papers spread across the table without really seeing them. "My father used to say a man's word and a man's land were the same thing," he finally said. "Both worth protecting, both worth dying for, if it came to that. He built this place out of nothing, arrived here with barely $1 to his name, worked himself half to death for 15 years to make something out of raw prairie." His voice roughened slightly. "When the fever took him and my mother both in the same week, I was 19 years old, and everybody in this territory expected me to fail. Expected me to sell out to the first buyer who came along and slink back east with my tail between my legs." "But you didn't," Clara said softly. "No," Ethan said. "I didn't. I stayed. I worked. I proved every single person who doubted me wrong, one season at a time, until this ranch wasn't just something I inherited. It was something I built same as my father built it before me." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "If I let Nathan Cole take this creek from me now, after everything, it isn't just water I'm losing. It's every year I spent proving I belonged here in the first place." Clara reached across the table without quite deciding to, and rested her hand over his. "Then we won't let him take it," she said simply. Ethan looked down at her hand covering his, and something passed between them, quiet, unspoken, but unmistakable, before he gently turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together. "We?" he repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." Neither of them moved for a long moment, the lamplight flickering low between them. The weight of everything unsaid pressing warm and heavy in the small kitchen. Then from outside, the sound of a horse approaching, fast, broke the moment entirely. Ethan was on his feet in an instant, hand instinctively going to the rifle propped by the door. Clara rose too, heart pounding as boots hit the porch steps hard and fast. "Ethan!" Tommy's voice, breathless, panicked. "Ethan, come quick! It's the herd north pasture, somebody cut the fence!" Ethan was already moving, grabbing his hat and his rifle. "How many head got out?" "Don't know yet. Ruiz is trying to count, but it's dark, and they scattered toward the ridge. Get Frank, get the lanterns, I'm right behind you." Ethan turned back to Clara for one brief, urgent moment. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me." "Ethan, wait." But he was already gone, boots pounding down the porch steps, swinging up onto his horse, before Clara had even reached the door, and she stood there in the doorway, watching him disappear into the dark toward the north pasture. Her heart in her throat, the warmth of his hand still lingering on hers, even as fear for his safety crowded out every other feeling. It was nearly dawn before the men returned, exhausted, mud-streaked, having recovered most of the scattered cattle, but not without cost. 2 calves lost in a ravine during the chaotic night search, and a length of fence deliberately cut, not broken, the clean lines of it unmistakable to anyone who looked closely. "That wasn't an accident," Ruiz said grimly, examining the severed wire in the gray morning light. "Somebody did this on purpose." Ethan's face was carved from stone. "Cole, you can't prove that," Ruiz said, though his tone suggested he believed it just as much as Ethan did. "No," Ethan agreed. "Not yet." Clara, standing at the edge of the yard, with a pot of coffee she'd made, the moment she heard the men returning, felt something cold and furious settle into her chest. This wasn't a legal dispute over old survey lines anymore. This was something uglier, something that had crossed from paperwork into real tangible harm. "Ethan," she said quietly once the men had dispersed to tend their exhausted horses, "this is getting dangerous." "I know," he said. "What if next time it isn't cattle in a ravine?" Ethan looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, Clara saw something like real fear behind his steady gray eyes. Not fear for himself, she realized, but fear of what might happen to the people around him. To her, if Nathan Cole's ambition wasn't checked soon. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said, low and fierce. "Whatever else comes of this, I promise you that." "I'm not asking you to protect me," Clara said. "I'm asking you to let me help you fight this. Properly. Together." Something in Ethan's expression shifted surprise, then something warmer, something that looked almost like relief at not having to carry the weight of it entirely alone. "All right," he said quietly. "Together." Kib. It was Ruiz, of all people, who suggested the path forward a few days later over a breakfast eaten in tense, watchful silence. "You need a lawyer," he said, breaking the quiet. "A real one from Cheyenne, not some local fella who owes Cole favors. And you need the original survey records from the county archive, not just your father's copies. If Cole's trying to claim the boundary was drawn wrong, you need the original county filing to prove it wasn't." "That's a 2-day ride to Cheyenne," Ethan said. "I can't leave the ranch unattended that long, not with Cole cutting fences in the dark." "I'll go," Clara said immediately. The table went quiet. Every man looked at her like she'd suggested something faintly absurd. "Clara," Ethan said carefully, "that's not what, not something a woman should do." Clara's chin lifted, that old familiar fire rising in her chest, the same fire that had carried her across half a continent, believing she deserved a life of her own choosing. "I can read legal documents as well as any lawyer, Ethan. I can request records from a county archive. And frankly, I'm the one person on this ranch Nathan Cole underestimates most, which might work entirely in our favor." Ethan studied her for a long moment, and Clara could see him weighing every instinct that told him to keep her safe at the ranch against the plain, practical truth of what she was offering. "Tommy could drive her," Ruiz offered. "Boy's steady enough on the road, and it keeps her from traveling alone." "I don't need," Clara started. "You're not traveling alone," Ethan said, in a tone that left no room for argument, though there was no real coldness in it, only the plain, protective concern of a man who had already begun, whether he'd admit it aloud yet or not, to care for her far more than practical arrangements alone required. "Tommy goes with you. That's not negotiable, Clara." Clara considered pushing back further, but something in his eyes, steady, unwavering, worried softened her resolve. "All right," she said. "Tommy comes with me." The 2-day ride to Cheyenne passed without major incident, though Clara found her mind returning again and again to the warmth of Ethan's hand over hers in the lamplight, to the fierce protective edge in his voice when he'd promised nothing would happen to her, to the strange, unfamiliar ache of missing someone she'd known for barely a month. Cheyenne itself was larger than Clara expected, bustling with the particular energy of a territory capital, and it took the better part of a day navigating between the county archive and a recommended lawyer's office before Clara finally sat across a desk from a sharp-eyed attorney named Mr. Hargrove, the original survey documents spread between them. "This is fairly clear-cut, Miss Whitmore," Hargrove said, examining the papers carefully. "The original 1867 survey plainly establishes the creek boundary as part of the Walker parcel. Mr. Cole's claim appears to hinge entirely on a secondary survey filed just 3 weeks ago. Conveniently timed, wouldn't you say, given the dispute only surfaced after that filing?" "Can you prove the second survey is fraudulent?" Clara asked. "Proving fraud is a serious undertaking," Hargrove said carefully. "But proving the second survey contradicts established county records filed and witnessed 15 years prior. That Miss Whitmore is considerably more straightforward, and it may be enough to have Mr. Cole's claim dismissed outright, provided the judge assigned to the case isn't already in his pocket." "Is that a real concern?" Hargrove's expression turned grim. "In this territory, Miss Whitmore with a man of Cole's resources, it's always a concern." Clara left the office with copies of the original survey clutched tight against her chest. A fragile new hope taking root beneath the exhaustion of the long journey. And it was only as she and Tommy made their way back toward the boarding house, where they'd taken rooms for the night, that she noticed a familiar figure standing across the street watching her with an expression that turned her blood cold. Silas Grant, Nathan Cole's foreman here in Cheyenne, 300 miles from Walker Creek Ranch, watching her with the flat calculating eyes of a man taking careful note of everything he saw. "Miss Whitmore," Tommy said uneasily, following her gaze. "Ain't that?" "Yes," Clara said quietly. "Keep walking, Tommy. Don't look at him again." But it was too late. Silas was already crossing the street toward them, an unhurried, deliberate pace that somehow felt more menacing than if he'd rushed. "Fancy running into you here," Silas said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. "Long way from Walker's ranch." "I could say the same of you," Clara said, keeping her voice level, despite the unease crawling up her spine. "Business," Silas said simply. "Mr. Cole's got interests all over this territory. Yours too, apparently." "My business is my own," Clara said. Silas's eyes flicked to the papers clutched in her arms, and something in his expression sharpened. "That survey work you're carrying," he said, "wouldn't happen to be about a certain creek boundary, would it?" Clara's grip tightened involuntarily on the papers. "I don't see how that concerns you." "It concerns me plenty," Silas said, and the false politeness dropped away entirely, now replaced by something harder, more openly threatening. "Mr. Cole's not a man who takes kindly to interference, Miss Whitmore. You'd do well to remember that, before you go stirring up trouble. That's got nothing to do with you." "Ethan's fight has everything to do with me," Clara said, chin lifting, refusing to let the fear crawling through her chest show on her face. "I'd suggest you tell your employer that threatening a woman on a public street in Cheyenne is a poor strategy should he ever want his claims taken seriously by an honest judge." Something flickered in Silas's eyes, surprise maybe at her refusal to back down. "Careful, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. "Fences get cut. Cattle stray. Bad things happen out on lonely ranches sometimes, and nobody's ever quite sure why." The threat hung in the air between them, unmistakable, now no longer hidden behind polite deniability. "Is that a confession, Mr. Grant?" Clara asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Because I'd be more than happy to repeat that exact sentence to the judge overseeing this case." Silas's jaw tightened, and for a moment Clara thought she'd pushed too far, that the careful mask of civility might drop away entirely into something dangerous. But then, he simply tipped his hat again, the same mocking gesture as before, and stepped back. "Enjoy your trip back to the ranch, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Roads can be dangerous this time of year, full of unexpected trouble." He walked away without another word, and Clara stood frozen for a long moment, Tommy's hand suddenly gripping her arm. "Miss Whitmore," he said, voice tight with worry. "We should get back to the boarding house, now." They left for the ranch at first light the next morning, taking a longer route. Tommy insisted on, out of caution, both of them watching the road behind them more than either wanted to admit. It was nearly dusk on the second day when Walker Creek Ranch finally came into view, and Clara felt something in her chest loosen at the sight of it. The modest house, the familiar barn, and Ethan already striding out from the porch before the wagon had even fully stopped, worry etched plain across his face. "You're safe," he said, reaching up to help her down before the wheels had stopped turning, his hands lingering on her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "I've been half out of my mind since yesterday morning." "We're fine," Clara said, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying the encounter she'd been trying to hold together inside her since Cheyenne. "Ethan, something happened." His expression sharpened instantly. "What?" She told him everything. The survey documents, Hargrove's cautious optimism, and then, more haltingly, the encounter with Silas Grant on the street, the thinly veiled threat about fences and cattle, and unexpected trouble on lonely ranches. By the time she finished, Ethan's jaw was tight enough to crack stone. "He threatened you," he said, voice low and dangerous in a way Clara hadn't heard from him before. "He threatened both of us," Clara said. "Ethan, I don't think this is only about the water rights anymore. I think he means to frighten us into giving up entirely." "Then he's about to learn how badly he's misjudged both of us," Ethan said. He took the survey documents from her, carefully examining them by the fading evening light, and something in his shoulders eased slightly at what he found there. "This is good, Clara," he said. "This is real evidence. If Hargrove's right about the timing on Cole's filing, we might actually have him." "There's something else," Clara said quietly. "Something I haven't been able to stop thinking about since Cheyenne." "What's that?" Silas said Cole's not a man who takes kindly to interference. But it wasn't just a threat about the land dispute, Ethan. There was something almost personal in the way he said it. Like there's more to this than a boundary line and some water rights. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring out toward the darkening ridge, where weeks ago, now someone had cut his fence line in the dead of night. "There usually is," he said finally. "Men like Cole don't fight this hard over something as simple as water, not when he's got other creeks on his own land already. There's something else driving this. I just haven't figured out what yet." Clara looked at him, at the tired determination in his face, and felt something fierce and protective rise in her own chest. Not fear this time, but resolve. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said. "Whatever it is." Ethan met her eyes, and for a moment, standing in the fading light with danger circling closer around them both, something unspoken passed between them. Not just partnership in a fight. Neither of them had asked for, but something deeper. Something neither one was quite ready to name aloud, though it lived plainly now in every look, every unguarded moment, every quiet hour spent working side by side against a threat that was only just beginning to show its true shape. Neither of them yet knew that the answer to what truly drove Nathan Cole's obsession with Walker Creek's water rights was already sitting in a locked drawer in his study, in the form of a second, far older document. One that, if ever uncovered, would reveal that his interest in this land had nothing to do with cattle or water at all, and everything to do with a secret buried 15 years deep in the county's oldest, most carefully forgotten records. The days after Cheyenne moved differently than the days before it, sharper somehow. Every ordinary moment shadowed by the knowledge that somewhere out there, Nathan Cole was still working, still scheming, still convinced that a ranch and a woman he'd once thrown away were both things he could simply reach out and take back. Clara felt it in the way Ethan checked the horizon more often, now the way Ruiz kept a rifle within reach, even while mending fence, the way Tommy had stopped venturing far from the house alone. "We can't live like this," Clara said one morning, watching Frank walk the perimeter of the yard before he'd even had his coffee. "Waiting for the next thing he does to us." "No," Ethan agreed, jaw tight. "We can't." "Then we stop waiting." He looked at her, something sharpening in his gray eyes. "What did you have in mind?" Clara set down the letter she'd been drafting to Hargrove and folded her hands on the table, the same posture she used to take years ago when she was about to argue a difficult point with a boarding house landlady who didn't want to hear it. "Silas Grant said something in Cheyenne that's been sitting wrong with me ever since," she said. "He said Cole doesn't take kindly to interference. Not the ranch, not the water. Interference. Like this fight was never really about a creek boundary at all." You think there's something else driving this? Ethan said slowly. I think a man doesn't risk fraud, doesn't send his foreman to threaten a woman on a public street over water he could just as easily buy rights to from 3 other ranches in this territory, Clara said. There's something underneath this, Ethan. Something he's protecting as much as something he's chasing. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, turning the thought over. My father used to say something about Cole's family. He said finally slowly, like the memory was working its way loose after years buried. Something about how Cole's father bought his original spread awful cheap right around the time a lot of the smaller homestead claims out this way got bought up or pushed out. I never thought much of it. A lot of land changed hands in those years. Bought cheap or taken cheap? Clara asked. Ethan's eyes met hers and something cold passed between them. I don't know, he admitted. But I think it's time we found out. It was Ruiz once again who proved the most useful ally in tracking down the truth, though this time not through any legal knowledge, but through the simple patient accumulation of an old man's memory. 16 years back. Ruiz said that evening, sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee cooling untouched in his hands, his eyes fixed somewhere far off in the past. There was a family out past the eastern ridge. Hendricks, I believe the name was. Small operation, but the land ran right along the same creek as yours. Ethan further downstream, but the same water source. I don't remember any Hendricks family, Ethan said. You wouldn't, Ruiz said. You were barely more than a boy, and it was before your folks passed. Word around town at the time was the Hendricks land got sold off sudden. Whole family gone inside a season. Nobody talked much about why. Sold to who? Clara asked, already feeling the shape of the answer settling cold in her stomach. Ruiz looked at her and then at Ethan, and the answer didn't need saying aloud. Cole's father, Ethan said quietly. That land would sit right in the middle of what Cole's claiming now, Clara said, mind racing. If the original survey was ever disputed, if there was ever a question about how the Hendricks family lost that land, it could unravel everything. Not just this new claim, his whole original deed. That's a 15-year-old story with no family left around to tell it, Ethan said. How do we prove any of that in a court in Cheyenne? Clara was already on her feet, energy crackling through her like she hadn't felt since the desperate, determined days of managing boarding house accounts on the edge of ruin. County records, she said. If the Hendricks family filed any complaint at all before they left any dispute, any letter, anything, it would be in the same archive where I found your original survey. Hargrove said the second survey Cole filed contradicted the county's original records. What if it's not the only document in that archive that contradicts Cole's story? Ethan studied her, something like awe mixing with the worry still etched across his face. You want to go back to Cheyenne, he said. I want to go back to Cheyenne, Clara confirmed. After what happened with Silas. Because of what happened with Silas, Clara said firmly. He wouldn't have threatened me over nothing, Ethan. Men like that don't waste fear on things that don't matter. Whatever's buried in that archive, it's dangerous enough that Cole's already trying to frighten us away from finding it. Ethan was quiet for the long moment, and Clara could see the war playing out plainly behind his eyes, the same instinct that wanted to lock her safely inside the house and never let danger near her again, warring against the plain, undeniable truth that she was right, and that hiding from this fight had never once made either of them safer. I'm coming with you this time, he said finally. Not sending you off with just Tommy again. The ranch. Ruiz and Frank can hold the ranch a few days, Ethan said. I'm not letting you face Cole's people alone again. That's not negotiable, Clara. Something in the fierce protective set of his jaw made Clara's chest tighten with an emotion too large and too unfamiliar to examine closely just then. All right, she said softly. Together then. The ride to Cheyenne felt different this time. Not lighter exactly, given the danger still coiled tight around every mile of road, but steadier somehow with Ethan beside her, instead of Tommy alone. They talked more than Clara expected, filling the long hours of travel with pieces of themselves, Neither had quite gotten around to sharing yet Ethan's memories of his mother's garden, long since gone to seed after her death. Clara's memories of a childhood before her parents died, before the hard years of service work, when she'd still believed the world owed her something gentle. "You never talk about before," Ethan observed as the wagon rolled steadily through open grassland. "Before your parents passed, I mean." "There's not much to tell," Clara said. "Ordinary happiness mostly. My father worked as a clerk. My mother kept a garden not so different from the one you mentioned. We weren't wealthy, but we were—" She searched for the word. "Whole. And then we weren't, and I spent so many years after just trying to survive that I stopped letting myself remember what whole felt like." "And now?" Ethan asked quietly. Clara looked at him at the steady, careful way he watched the road. The protective tension still in his shoulders, even in this rare, quiet moment between them. "Now," she said slowly, "I'm starting to remember." Something passed across Ethan's face. Warmth and something rawer beneath it. Something that looked almost like fear at how much he'd already come to care for her in so short a time. "Clara," he started, and then stopped himself, jaw tightening. "What?" "Nothing," he said. "Now's not the time." "Ethan." "When this is settled," he said, and there was a promise in his voice, quiet but absolute. "When Cole's threat is behind us and you're safe, and this fight isn't hanging over everything we say to each other, then I'll tell you what I mean to tell you. Not before." Clara felt her heart pound at the weight in his words, at everything left unspoken, but plainly understood between them, and she nodded, letting the moment settle rather than pushing further. "When this is settled," she echoed softly. Ditu. The county archive in Cheyenne was a cramped, dusty building, tended by an elderly clerk named Mr. Whitfield, who peered at Clara and Ethan over wire-rimmed spectacles, with the particular suspicion of a man who guarded paperwork like it was gold. "Hendricks," he repeated after Clara explained what they were looking for. "That's a name I haven't heard spoken in a long while." "You remember them?" Ethan asked. "Course I remember them," Whitfield said, shuffling toward a back room lined floor to ceiling with record boxes. "Small family. Good people far as I ever knew. Left rather sudden as I recall. Always seemed strange to me given how hard they'd worked that land." "Do you have any record of why they left?" Clara asked, heart pounding. Whitfield disappeared into the back room for what felt like an agonizing eternity, boxes shuffling, dust rising in visible clouds through the single shaft of window light, before he finally emerged with a thin yellowed folder clutched in his weathered hands. "There's a complaint here," he said, slowly squinting at the faded ink. "Filed by a Thomas Hendricks, dated—" He peered closer. 16 years back. Alleges his land was seized under threat, the deed signed under duress after his cattle were poisoned and his barn burned. Names a Jeremiah Cole as the party responsible." The words hung in the dusty air like a thunderclap. "Jeremiah Cole," Ethan repeated. "That's Nathan's father." "Was there ever an investigation?" Clara asked, hands trembling as she reached for the folder. Whitfield's expression turned grim. "Judge at the time was a man named Barrow. Convenient enough, Barrow ruled the complaint unsubstantiated within the month, and the Hendricks family left the territory not long after. Never heard what became of them." Clara scanned the complaint with rising urgency, and there near the bottom of the second page, a line that made her breath catch entirely. "Ethan," she said, voice unsteady. "Look at this." He leaned over her shoulder, and she watched his face change as he read the line. She pointed to a description of the exact boundary Hendricks claimed had been stolen, a boundary that ran precisely along the same creek Nathan Cole was now trying to claim from Walker Creek Ranch. "He's not just trying to steal water from me," Ethan said slowly, understanding dawning cold and sharp across his face. "He's trying to finish what his father started. If this creek boundary ever gets properly surveyed against the original 1867 filing, it wouldn't just prove your claim, Clara. It would prove his family's entire original deed to half their land was built on stolen ground. That's why he's fighting this so hard," Clara breathed. That's why Silas threatened me in the street. If this comes out, he loses everything, Ethan finished. Not just the water, the ranch. His whole inheritance exposed as built on fraud and violence against a family who never got justice. Whitfield, listening to the exchange with growing alarm, glanced nervously toward the archive door. "You two didn't hear any of this from me," he said quietly. "Cole's got friends in this town same as everywhere else. I'll make you copies of everything in this file, but I'd advise you get out of Cheyenne quick and quiet, and don't let anybody see you leaving with those papers." They left Cheyenne before dawn. The next morning, the precious copies of the Hendricks complaint, wrapped carefully and hidden beneath the wagon bench, both of them tense and watchful, the entire ride back toward the ranch. It was nearly midday, still an hour from home, when Ethan suddenly pulled the wagon to a hard stop, eyes fixed on something ahead on the road. "Ethan." Clara followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. 3 riders blocked the road ahead, and even from this distance, Clara recognized Silas Grant's lean, sharp-eyed silhouette among them. "Get down low," Ethan said quietly, urgently. "Whatever happens, Clara, stay behind me." "Ethan, there's 3 of them." "I know." His hand moved to the rifle at his side, jaw set hard. "Doesn't change what I'm about to do." The riders approached at an unhurried pace, and Silas's voice carried easy and cold across the remaining distance. "Afternoon, Walker, Miss Whitmore." His eyes flicked pointedly to the wagon bench. "Productive trip to Cheyenne, I take it." "Get out of the road, Silas," Ethan said, voice flat and hard. "Now that's not particularly neighborly," Silas said, though his companions had already begun spreading out on either side of the wagon, boxing them in. "Mr. Cole just wants to know what you two found so interesting in that county archive. Word travels fast in a small territory." "Whatever we found is between us and the court," Clara said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite her racing heart. "Not you, and certainly not your employer." Silas's eyes narrowed. "You've got something in that wagon, don't you? Something Mr. Cole would very much like to know about." "Then he can ask his lawyer to request it properly," Ethan said. "Same as anyone else with a legitimate claim would." "Legitimate," Silas repeated, and something ugly crept into his voice. "That's rich coming from a man about to lose his whole ranch." "Move your men out of the road, Silas," Ethan said, his voice dropping into something dangerously calm. "This is your only warning." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Clara's heart pounded so loud she was certain the men could hear it. Certain this was the moment everything Ethan had promised her, that nothing would happen to her, was about to be tested in the worst possible way. Then, from somewhere behind them on the road, the sound of approaching hoofbeats, several riders at speed, broke the standoff entirely. Silas's eyes flicked past the wagon, and something like frustration crossed his face as Ruiz and Frank came into view, riding hard rifles already in hand, having clearly grown worried enough at Ethan and Clara's delayed return to ride out searching for them. "Everything all right here?" Ruiz called, pulling his horse to a stop beside the wagon, his weathered face hard as flint as he took in the standoff. Silas's jaw tightened, calculating odds that had suddenly shifted against him. "Just a friendly conversation," he said, backing his horse away slowly. "We'll be seeing you soon, Walker. Miss Whitmore." His eyes lingered on Clara, a moment too long, cold and promising. "Real soon." He and his men rode off, and Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of fear. "You're all right?" Ethan asked immediately, turning to her hands, framing her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the hard tension still radiating off him. "I'm all right," Clara said, though her voice shook. "Ethan, that was—" "I know," he said grimly. "I know exactly what that was." Back at the ranch with the Hendricks documents safely locked away, and Hargrove already notified by urgent letter of the discovery, the household settled into a tense, watchful waiting that stretched over the following 2 weeks. A waiting that ended finally with a summons Clara had almost stopped believing would come. The hearing was set for the following Thursday in the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne, and the entire ranch traveled together this time. Ethan, Clara, Ruiz, Frank, and Tommy. None of them willing to leave anyone behind after the encounter on the road. The courthouse was more crowded than Clara expected, word of the dispute having apparently spread through the territory faster than any of them realized, and she felt every eye in the room settle on her and Ethan. As they took their seats, felt the weight of a town's judgment pressing down, just as heavy as it had that first terrible evening on the train platform. Though this time, she realized with something like wonder, she did not feel alone in carrying it. Nathan Cole sat across the aisle, flanked by a sharp, expensive-looking lawyer, his expression carefully composed into something like wounded innocence. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the room came to its feet, as Judge Marcus Ellery entered, a stern, weathered man, whose reputation Hargrove had assured them was considerably more honest than the disgraced Judge Barrows had been 16 years prior. The proceedings began with Cole's lawyer laying out the claim, the disputed boundary, the second survey, the assertion that the original 1867 filing contained an error that had gone uncorrected for 15 years, purely through oversight. An oversight, Hargrove said, rising when it came his turn, that Mr. Cole conveniently discovered only after my client's household began asking uncomfortable questions about a 15-year-old land seizure connected directly to Mr. Cole's own family. A ripple of murmurs moved through the courtroom. Nathan's composed expression cracked just slightly, his eyes flicking toward Clara and Ethan with something sharp and furious. "Objection," Cole's lawyer said quickly. "Counsel is introducing entirely unrelated matters. They are far from unrelated, Your Honor," Hargrove said, and with the judge's reluctant permission, laid out the Hendricks complaint before the court, in full, methodical detail. The poisoned cattle, the burned barn, the coerced signature, the judge who had dismissed the complaint within a month, under circumstances that Hargrove with careful, devastating precision suggested were anything but coincidental. The courtroom had gone utterly silent, every eye fixed now not on Clara or Ethan, but on Nathan Cole, whose composed mask had entirely crumbled into something pale and furious. "This is outrageous," Nathan said, rising from his seat, despite his lawyer's restraining hand. "My father built his ranch through honest work, same as any man in this territory." "Your father's ranch," Hargrove said calmly, "sits on land whose original deed appears to have been secured through arson poisoning and coercion against a family who never received justice for what was taken from them. And now, 16 years later, you've attempted precisely the same tactics, intimidation, fraud, and threats against Ethan Walker and Clara Whitmore in an effort to seize the very same creek boundary your father once stole from the Hendricks family." "You have no proof of any of this," Nathan snapped. "I have a sworn complaint filed contemporaneously by Thomas Hendricks himself, describing events in precise detail," Hargrove said. "I have testimony from Mr. Grant here." He gestured toward the back of the courtroom where Clara turned in surprise to see Silas Grant seated stiffly flanked by two territorial marshals, who, faced with his own potential prosecution for the threats made against Miss Whitmore in Cheyenne 2 weeks ago, has proven remarkably willing to describe in detail the instructions he received from Mr. Cole regarding both the fence-cutting incident at Walker Creek Ranch and the intimidation of Miss Whitmore. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Clara felt Ethan's hand find hers beneath the table, gripping tight. "Silas," Nathan said, turning toward his foreman with something between betrayal and fury. "I'm not hanging for your family's sins, Nathan," Silas said flatly, refusing to meet his former employer's eyes. "Told the marshals everything, the fence, the threats, all of it. Wasn't worth prison to keep protecting you." Nathan sank back into his seat. All the color drained from his face, and Clara watched the man who had once looked at her like she was a disappointing purchase, now unravel entirely in front of the same town that had once watched her humiliation with quiet, uncaring judgment. Judge Ellery's expression had gone hard as granite. "Mr. Cole," he said, "given the evidence presented today, this court finds your claim against the Walker Creek boundary entirely without merit, and furthermore, orders a full territorial investigation into the original acquisition of your family's land based on the sworn complaint entered into evidence today." He paused, letting the weight of the ruling settle over the courtroom. I would also strongly advise you retain separate counsel for the criminal matters, Mr. Grant's testimony has raised, as I expect. The territorial prosecutor will have considerable interest in pursuing charges related to both the historical seizure and the recent threats and property damage inflicted upon Mr. Walker's ranch. The gavel came down final and absolute, and the courtroom erupted into a wave of murmured astonishment. Clara sat frozen for a moment, hardly able to process the sheer sweeping totality of the victory, before Ethan's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her close, and she felt for the first time since that terrible evening on the train platform the full and complete weight of safety settle over her. "It's over," Ethan said, voice rough with emotion. "Clara, it's actually over." But it wasn't quite not yet, because as the courtroom began to empty, Nathan Cole, stripped now of every ounce of his cold composure, pushed his way through the departing crowd directly toward them, something wild and desperate in his eyes. "This isn't finished," he said, voice shaking with barely controlled fury, loud enough that heads turned throughout the emptying courtroom. "You think this is over? You think stealing my foreman's testimony wins you anything real?" "Nathan," Ethan said, stepping slightly in front of Clara, voice low in warning. "No," Nathan said, and something unhinged had crept into his expression, now the careful mask entirely gone. "You took my ranch's future in there today. You humiliated me in front of the entire territory. And for what? For her." He jabbed a finger toward Clara, contempt, and something raw beneath it twisting his features. "A woman I threw away because she wasn't good enough for a proper wife." The courtroom had gone silent again. Dozens of eyes fixed now on the unfolding scene, and Clara felt the old familiar humiliation rise in her chest, the same helpless shame she'd felt on that train platform weeks ago, the sense of an entire town watching her be found wanting. But this time, before the shame could fully take hold, Ethan's voice cut through the courtroom, clear and absolute, and utterly without hesitation. "You want to know why I stood beside her, Nathan?" He said, loud enough for every remaining person in that courtroom to hear. "It's not because she needed rescuing. It's not because I felt sorry for a woman you humiliated on a train platform. I chose her because in every single moment since that day, she has shown more courage, more honesty, and more genuine character than you have managed in your entire miserable life." The courtroom had gone utterly silent now. Every eye fixed on Ethan, and Clara felt her breath catch entirely as he turned to face her directly, taking both her hands in his, the rest of the room falling away entirely from his focus. "I don't need her because my ranch needs help, or because my kitchen needed a woman's hand in it," Ethan said, his voice dropping into something raw and unguarded, meant now only for her, though the whole courtroom could hear every word. "I want her because she makes my life better. Because for the first time since I lost my parents, I don't feel like I'm just surviving out on that ranch alone. I feel like I'm actually living, and that's because of her." Clara's eyes filled with tears, the weight of the entire day, the entire month breaking loose all at once, and she barely registered Nathan's furious, humiliated retreat from the courtroom. The marshals moving to escort Silas Grant toward whatever consequences awaited him, the murmured astonishment rippling through the remaining crowd. All she registered was Ethan standing before her, having just chosen her completely, publicly, unmistakably, in front of the very town that had once watched her be discarded. "Ethan," she whispered. "I meant every word," he said softly. "I've meant it for weeks now, if I'm honest. I just didn't want to say it until this fight was behind us, until you could be certain it wasn't fear or gratitude talking, just the truth." "And the truth is?" Clara asked, voice trembling. "The truth," Ethan said, "is that I love you, Clara Whitmore. Not because you needed somewhere to go that first terrible night. Because of who you've shown me you are every single day since." Clara felt the words land somewhere deep. Somewhere Nathan Cole's 41 letters had never once managed to reach somewhere that had been guarded and careful and afraid for far too long. "I love you too," she said, and the words came easier than she expected, truer than anything she'd said in years. "I think I have for longer than I let myself admit." Around them, the courtroom had mostly emptied Ruiz and Frank and Tommy, watching from a respectful distance, with matching grins. and somewhere outside the Wyoming sun was breaking through a bank of clouds that had hung heavy over Cheyenne all morning. But Clara barely noticed any of it, because in that moment, standing in a courtroom where she had once feared total ruin, she felt instead the full, unmistakable certainty of having finally found exactly where she belonged. But even as Ethan pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home, neither of them yet knew that Nathan Cole, humiliated and desperate, and facing the complete unraveling of everything his family had built on stolen ground, was already retreating toward the edge of town, with something far more dangerous than a lawsuit taking shape behind his wild, furious eyes. Because a man with nothing left to lose, Ethan would soon learn, was infinitely more dangerous than a man merely fighting to win. The ride back from Cheyenne should have felt like a celebration, and for the first few miles it almost did Tommy whooping from the wagon bench, Ruiz allowing himself an actual grin, Frank recounting the courtroom scene for the third time like it might somehow improve with retelling. But Clara couldn't shake the memory of Nathan Cole's face in that final moment. The wildness in his eyes. The way he'd looked at her and Ethan like something had broken loose inside him that no courtroom ruling could put back. "You're quiet," Ethan said, riding close beside the wagon, his eyes on her rather than the road. "I keep thinking about what he said," Clara admitted. "This isn't finished. He didn't sound like a man accepting defeat, Ethan. He sounded like a man already planning something worse." "He's got nothing left to plan with," Ethan said. "No claim on the land. No foreman willing to lie for him anymore. His own father's crimes about to be dragged through a territorial investigation." He shook his head. "Man's finished, Clara. Whatever pride he's got left, it's not enough to act on." Clara wanted to believe that. She wanted badly to let the victory in that courtroom be the end of it, to let herself simply exist in the warm, astonishing reality of Ethan's declaration of her own, answering one without the cold shadow of Nathan Cole's fury trailing behind them all the way home. But something in her wouldn't settle. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said. "All of you, just for a while longer." "I promise," Ethan said, and reached over to squeeze her hand where it rested on the wagon rail, a gesture so simple and so certain that it eased, if only slightly, the knot of unease sitting in her chest. The weeks that followed were, for a while, everything Clara had once believed impossible for herself. The ranch settled into a rhythm unlike anything she'd known before, mornings that began not with dread, but with quiet contentment, evenings spent at the kitchen table not poring over legal documents, but simply talking, laughing, existing together without the weight of a courtroom battle hanging over every conversation. Ethan began speaking more openly than she'd ever seen him, telling her stories of his childhood, of his mother's laugh, of the particular stubbornness his father had passed down to him, along with the ranch itself. Clara found herself doing the same unburdening years of carefully guarded grief and loneliness she hadn't realized she'd been carrying quite so heavily until she began piece by piece setting it down. "You're different than you were that first night," Ethan observed one evening, watching her from across the porch as she mended a shirt by lamplight. "Different how?" "Lighter," he said. "Like something's finally stopped pressing down on you." Clara considered that, setting her needle down for a moment. "I think for the first time in my life I'm not just surviving something, I'm actually living it." Ethan crossed the porch and settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I want to ask you something," he said, and something in his voice made Clara's pulse quicken. "Ask me." "Not tonight," he said with the faintest hint of a smile. "But soon. I want to do it properly, Clara. You deserve properly after everything you've survived to get here." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, understanding plainly what he meant, without him having to say it outright. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future stretching out ahead of her felt like something to look forward to, rather than something to simply endure. It was perhaps the very peak of her happiness, and it lasted almost exactly 11 days before everything shattered again. It began deceptively as an ordinary morning. Clara was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she kneaded bread dough when Tommy came tearing through the front door, breathless and pale. "Miss Whitmore," he gasped. "Something's wrong at the North Pasture." Ethan sent me back for you. Said come quick, said it's urgent." Clara's stomach dropped instantly. "What kind of wrong, Tommy?" "Didn't say," Tommy said, already turning back toward the door. "Just said hurry." Clara didn't stop to remove her apron. She followed Tommy out to the wagon, climbed up beside him, and held tight to the rail as he urged the horse into a hard, jarring run toward the north pasture, her heart hammering the entire way with a dread she couldn't quite name, but felt bone-deep certain was justified. They found Ruiz first standing at the fence line, face grim, rifle in hand. "Where's Ethan?" Clara demanded, jumping down from the wagon before it had fully stopped. Ruiz's expression didn't ease. "He rode out to check on something down by the creek. Said he saw smoke." "Smoke? Ain't nothing burning that I can see," Ruiz said, uneasy. "But he's been gone longer than it should take." Clara felt cold dread spreading through her chest, the same instinct that had warned her something was wrong at the train station weeks ago now screaming at full volume. "That's not right," she said. "Ethan wouldn't have sent Tommy for me over smoke he was going to investigate himself. He'd have sent for you and Frank, not pulled me away from the house." Ruiz's face went sharp with sudden matching alarm. "You're right. That message didn't come through me." "Tommy," Clara said urgently, turning to the boy, "who told you to fetch me?" Tommy's face had gone pale. "There was a man, by the creek trail. Said Ethan sent him. Said Ethan needed me to fetch you quick." "What did he look like?" "Didn't recognize him," Tommy said, voice shaking now with dawning understanding. "Lean fella, sharp eyes. I didn't think nothing of it. He seemed to know Ethan's name and everything." "Silas." Clara breathed horror crashing over her in a wave. "Ruiz, that was a trap. Someone lured Tommy away from the ranch to get me out here, away from the house." The realization struck all three of them at the same instant, and Ruiz was already moving, rifle raised, scanning the tree line with hard, practiced eyes. "Get back in the wagon," he said. "Both of you now." The crack of a rifle shot split the air, and Clara screamed as Ruiz staggered, a red bloom spreading fast across his shoulder before he dropped hard to one knee, still gripping his own weapon, firing back toward the trees even as he fell. "Ruiz!" Tommy shouted, scrambling toward him. "Stay down!" Ruiz roared, even as he fired again, his voice tight with pain, but still fierce with command. "Clara, get to the wagon. Get out of here." But Clara was already moving toward him, not away, dropping to her knees beside the wounded old man, pressing her hands hard against the wound in his shoulder, even as more shots cracked from the tree line, even as Tommy dragged them both behind the meager cover of the wagon wheel. "You're going to be all right," Clara said, though her hands were shaking as badly as her voice, blood already soaking warm and terrible through her fingers. "Do you hear me? You're going to be all right. Where's the boss?" Ruiz gritted out, pain etched deep into his weathered face. "Somebody needs to warn him." "I'll go," Tommy said immediately, already moving. "No," Clara said sharply, catching his arm. "That's exactly what they want Tommy to scatter us, to pick us off one at a time. We stay together." Another shot cracked out closer this time, splintering wood from the wagon frame just above their heads, and Clara felt real bone-deep terror grip her chest for the first time since that terrible night the fence had been cut. "Ruiz," came a voice from the tree line, cold and unmistakable. "Silas Grant. Send the woman out and this ends here. You've got my word." "Your word's worth about as much as your boss's promises," Ruiz shouted back, voice strained but defiant. "Go to hell, Silas." Another shot answered him close enough that Clara felt the wind of it pass, and she pressed herself lower against the wagon wheel, heart hammering so violently she thought it might tear loose from her chest entirely. "Tommy," she whispered urgently. "The rifle in the wagon bed, can you reach it without exposing yourself?" Tommy's eyes were wide with terror, but he nodded, and inch by careful inch he began working his way toward the back of the wagon. It was in that terrible, suspended moment, pinned down, wounded, outnumbered, that Clara heard the sound that flooded her entire body with relief so violent it nearly buckled her hoofbeats, fast and furious, and Ethan's voice, roaring across the pasture, with a fury Clara had never once heard from him. Clara. What followed happened almost too fast for Clara to fully track Ethan thundering into the clearing on horseback rifle, already firing Frank close behind him, both men moving with the hard-practiced efficiency of ranchers who had spent their whole lives prepared for exactly this kind of violence, even if they'd hoped never to need it. Silas's men caught between Ruiz's continued defiant fire, and this sudden overwhelming reinforcement broke and scattered into the trees within minutes, and Clara heard Silas himself shouting furious retreating commands before the sound of fleeing horses faded into the distance entirely. Then Ethan was there off his horse before it had fully stopped dropping to his knees beside her hands, framing her face with a desperation that spoke louder than any words could have. "Clara, are you hit? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she gasped, though her hands were still slick with Ruiz's blood, though her whole body still trembled with the aftermath of terror. "It's Ruiz, Ethan. He's hit. We need to get him back to the house." Ethan's attention snapped instantly to his old friend, assessing the wound with the same fast, competent efficiency he brought to every crisis on the ranch, and within minutes, they had Ruiz loaded carefully into the wagon bed. Frank driving hard for the house, while Ethan rode alongside Clara pressed close against his side on horseback, unwilling to let even a few feet of distance separate them after everything that had just happened. "He lured Tommy away to get to me," Clara said, voice still unsteady. "Ethan, this wasn't about the ranch anymore. This was Nathan trying to hurt me directly to punish you through me." "I know," Ethan said, jaw tight with fury and fear in equal measure. "And he's going to answer for every single moment of it." Ruiz survived the wound, serious but not fatal. The bullet passed clean through without striking anything vital, though the doctor summoned urgently from town warned it would be weeks before the old man regained full use of his arm. "Told you?" Ruiz muttered weakly from his bed that evening, Clara sitting beside him with a bowl of broth she was determined he'd finish. "Told you to get to the wagon and leave you bleeding in the dirt," Clara said. "I don't take orders that poorly thought out, Ruiz." Despite the pain plainly etched across his face, something like a smile tugged at the old man's mouth. "Stubborn woman." "You'll live," Clara said, feeding him another spoonful of broth despite his weak protests. "And you'll thank me for this stubbornness eventually." Out in the front room, Clara could hear Ethan's voice, low and hard, talking with Frank and a territorial marshal who had ridden out the moment word reached town of the shooting. "This is attempted murder," the marshal was saying. "On top of everything already pending against Cole from the Cheyenne hearing. We'll have men out looking for Grant and whoever rode with him within the hour, and I'll be requesting a warrant for Cole's arrest before nightfall." "He won't go quietly," Ethan said grimly. "Man's got nothing left to lose now." "That's precisely why we need to move fast," the marshal said. "Desperate men do desperate things, Mr. Walker. I'd advise you keep close watch on this ranch until we've got both Grant and Cole in custody." Clara set down the broth bowl and moved to the doorway, listening, her heart still not fully settled from the terror of the afternoon. "Ethan," she said quietly, once the marshal had departed to organize the search, "this isn't over, is it?" "Not really." Ethan turned to her, and the fierce protective exhaustion in his face told her everything before he even spoke. "Not until they're both in custody," he admitted. "But Clara, I need you to hear something, and I need you to hear it clearly." "What? Today, when I heard those shots and knew you were out there?" His voice broke slightly, and he crossed the room to pull her close, his hands trembling faintly against her back in a way she'd never once seen from him. "I have never in my entire life been more afraid of anything than I was in that moment, thinking I might lose you." "I'm here," Clara said softly, pressing her hand flat against his chest, feeling his heart still racing beneath her palm. "I'm safe, Ethan. This time," he said. "But Cole's not done, and I won't rest easy until he's answering for what he's done once and for all." The search for Nathan Cole and Silas Grant stretched into the following week, tension gripping the ranch tight with every passing day of uncertainty. Word filtered in slowly from town. Silas had been spotted fleeing north, apparently abandoning Nathan entirely once the marshals began closing in, unwilling to hang for a man who'd already thrown him to the courts once to save himself. Nathan himself proved harder to find, apparently holed up somewhere on the outskirts of his own crumbling estate, his remaining ranch hands scattering as word of his impending arrest, and the territorial investigation into his father's crimes spread through the county. It was Ethan who finally received the news riding back from town on a gray, overcast afternoon with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. "They found him," he said, dismounting slowly. "Where?" Clara asked, heart pounding. "His own house." Ethan's voice was quiet, careful. "Marshals went to serve the arrest warrant this morning. Found him in his study, surrounded by every deed and document he owned, apparently trying to burn as much of it as he could before they arrived." "Is he in custody?" "He is," Ethan confirmed. "Didn't resist from what I heard. Just sat there and let them take him, muttering something about how none of it mattered anymore, how his father's sins had finally caught up with the both of them." Clara felt something complicated move through her chest. Not sympathy exactly, not after everything he'd done, but something adjacent to it, a recognition of just how thoroughly a man's own choices could unravel everything he'd once believed was his by right. And Silas? Still at large, Ethan admitted. But with Cole in custody and singing everything he knows to save whatever's left of his own hide, the marshals expect they'll have Silas within the week too. Man's got nowhere left to run, not with every lawman in the territory looking for him now. Clara let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for days. "It's really ending then," she said. "All of it. It's ending," Ethan confirmed and pulled her close, resting his chin against the top of her head in a gesture that had become in these short weeks achingly familiar and precious to her. "And when it's fully behind us, Clara Whitmore, I intend to finally ask you that question I've been holding on to properly." Silas Grant was captured 6 days later, attempting to cross into the neighboring territory, and with both men now facing trial. Nathan for the historical land fraud, the fence-cutting and conspiracy to commit the attack that had wounded Ruiz. Silas for his direct role in that same attack. The shadow that had hung over Walker Creek Ranch for months finally truly began to lift. Ruiz recovered, steadily regaining strength and stubborn good humor in equal measure, back to grumbling about his coffee-making duties within 3 weeks, despite Clara's insistence he rest longer. "Man can't sit still," Frank said, watching Ruiz limp determinedly toward the kitchen one morning, despite Clara's protests. "Never could." "I heard that," Ruiz called back, and Clara found herself laughing, the sound easy and unguarded in a way it hadn't been in months. The ranch slowly began to feel entirely safe again, not just safe from Nathan Cole's schemes, but safe in the deeper, more permanent way Clara had never quite believed possible for herself, the kind of safety built not on the absence of danger, but on the presence of people who would stand between her and any danger that came. It was on a quiet evening the whole household gathered on the porch after a simple, contented supper that Ethan finally rose from his seat and crossed to where Clara sat, something in his expression that made the whole porch fall suddenly, expectantly silent. "Clara," he said, and there was a slight nervous roughness to his voice that she'd never once heard from him, not even in the worst of the danger they'd faced together. "I told you back in that courtroom in Cheyenne that I loved you, and I meant every word of it. But I also told you I wanted to do this properly once everything with Cole was finally settled." He knelt right there on the porch in front of Ruiz and Frank and Tommy, all of them watching with matching delighted grins, and Clara felt her breath catch entirely as he took her hand in his. "You came into my life on the worst night of yours," Ethan said, left behind by a man who couldn't see what he was throwing away. "And in every single day since you've shown me exactly what real courage looks like, exactly what it means to build something honest, instead of something built on appearances and lies. I don't have much to offer you beyond this ranch and these hands and everything I am, but I'm offering it all the same, because I can't imagine a single day of my life from here forward that I don't want to spend building it with you." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a simple gold band, plain and unadorned, nothing like the fine jewelry Nathan Cole could have offered. "Clara Whitmore," Ethan said. "Will you marry me?" Clara felt tears spill freely down her cheeks, and for once she didn't try to hide them. Didn't try to be strong or composed or careful, the way she'd spent so many years training herself to be. "Yes," she said, and the word came out clear and certain, and utterly without hesitation. "Yes, Ethan. 1,000 times yes." The porch erupted into cheers and laughter, Tommy whooping loud enough to startle the horses in the corral. Ruiz wiping suspiciously at his eyes and blaming it on dust. Frank grinning so wide it looked like it might crack his weathered face in two, and Ethan rose to pull Clara into his arms, into a kiss that tasted like relief and joy, and every hard-won piece of happiness she had once believed she'd never be permitted to have. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you so completely, Ethan Walker." "I love you too," he said, voice thick with emotion. "For exactly who you are. Not who I hoped you'd be. Not who anyone expected you to be. Just you, Clara. Always just you." Behind them, the Wyoming sky had gone the deep, glorious purple of early evening. The first stars beginning to prick through the fading light. And Clara Whitmore, who had once stood alone and abandoned on a train platform, believing herself unwanted by the world, stood instead in the arms of a man who had chosen her completely freely, without a single condition attached, and felt for the first time in her entire life that she had truly finally come home. But even as the household celebrated late into that joyful evening, none of them yet knew that in a Cheyenne jail cell, many miles away, Nathan Cole sat awake in the dark, plotting one final desperate act. Because a trial date had just been set, and a man with nothing left to lose, facing the complete and total destruction of everything his family had ever built, was about to make one last dangerous attempt to ensure that if he went down, Ethan Walker and Clara Whitmore would not be left standing to celebrate their victory. The engagement should have been the beginning of nothing but joy, and for 3 days it was Clara and Ethan making quiet plans on the porch each evening. Ruiz already grumbling good-naturedly about having to wear a proper collar for the wedding. Tommy practicing with great embarrassment how he might finally ask that girl in town to the ceremony as his own guest. But on the 4th morning, a rider came fast up the road from town, and the look on his face was enough to still every ordinary sound on the ranch. "Marshall sent me," the young deputy said, breathless, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Cole escaped custody last night. Overpowered a guard during transfer to the Cheyenne courthouse. He's gone, and nobody's seen which direction." Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. "Escaped?" Ethan repeated, voice gone flat and cold. "How does a man escape a jail cell with marshals watching him?" "Don't rightly know the particulars," the deputy admitted. "Marshall said to warn you directly, given everything that already happened out here. Said Cole's got nothing left. No ranch, no reputation, facing charges serious enough to hang for if the fraud investigation confirms what happened to that Hendricks family. Man like that, Marshall said, might do anything." The words hung in the morning air like a blade. "Thank you for riding out," Ethan said, already turning toward the house, toward the rifle rack, toward the sudden urgent business of preparing for a threat that had just become immeasurably more dangerous than any lawsuit or land dispute. "Tell the marshal we'll keep close watch." "Ethan!" Clara caught at his arm the moment the deputy had ridden off, her heart hammering. "This is different from before. Before he had something to lose. Now he's got nothing." "I know," Ethan said grimly. "A man with nothing to lose doesn't think about consequences," Clara said. "He just thinks about who to blame." "I know that too," Ethan said, and pulled her close for one fierce, brief moment. "Which is exactly why you're not leaving my sight until he's back in custody. Not for a single minute." The ranch transformed within hours into something closer to a fortress than a home. Frank and Tommy took turns keeping watch from the barn loft, rifles within easy reach. Ruiz, still favoring his wounded shoulder, refused every suggestion that he rest indoors, insisting instead on sitting the porch with his own weapon across his lap. "Man shot me once already," Ruiz said when Clara tried gently to argue him back inside. "I intend to be standing here if he's fool enough to try it twice." Clara didn't argue further. She understood better now than she ever had before. The particular stubbornness that bound this household together, not blind loyalty, but the plain, unshakable choice each of them had made to stand for one another again and again, no matter the cost. Night fell heavy and watchful over Walker Creek Ranch. Every shadow suddenly weighted with possibility. Every distant sound, sending Clara's heart into her throat. She sat in the front room with Ethan, both of them too tense for sleep, a single lamp burning low between them. "Tell me honestly," Clara said quietly. "Do you think he'll come here?" Ethan was silent, a long moment weighing the question with the same careful honesty he brought to everything. "I think," he said finally, "that Nathan Cole has spent his entire life believing the world owed him whatever he wanted simply because his family had money and standing." Watching that entire belief collapse in a single courtroom, watching it collapse because of us specifically, I think a man like that doesn't run quietly into obscurity. I think he comes here first to try to take back some piece of what he thinks we stole from him. "That's not comforting," Clara admitted. "No," Ethan agreed. "But it's honest, and I'd rather you face this with clear eyes than false comfort." Clara reached for his hand across the small space between them, lacing her fingers through his. "Then we face it together," she said. "Same as everything else." It was well past midnight when the first sound came. Not gunfire, not shouting, but something smaller, more insidious. The faint, unmistakable crackle of flame catching dry wood carried on the night wind from the direction of the barn. "Fire!" Frank's voice, urgent and sharp, cut through the darkness from the loft. "Barn's catching west side." Ethan was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand already moving toward the door, but Clara caught his arm with sudden desperate certainty. "Ethan, wait, this is exactly what he wants. Draw everyone toward the fire. Scatter the defense same as he tried with Tommy at the north pasture." The realization struck them both at the same instant, cold and absolute. "He's using the barn as a distraction," Ethan said, already calculating. "Which means he's coming for the house directly while everyone's fighting the fire." "Then we don't let him separate us," Clara said fiercely. "Ruiz can rally Frank and Tommy on the fire. You and I stay here, watch the house itself." Ethan hesitated only a moment before nodding. Already shouting instructions out the window toward Ruiz, who acknowledged with a sharp wave, before directing Frank and Tommy toward the burning barn, with the fast, practiced authority of a man who had faced crisis on this ranch more times than he could count. The fire lit the night sky orange and furious, and for a long, tense stretch, Clara and Ethan stood together in the darkened front room, watching the yard through the window, waiting for a threat that felt somehow more dangerous for how invisible it remained. Then, from the back of the house, the unmistakable sound of a door being forced. "He's inside," Ethan breathed, already moving toward the sound, rifle raised. "Clara, stay behind me." They found him in this kitchen, Nathan Cole, gaunt and wild-eyed, in a way that bore almost no resemblance to the cold, composed man Clara had first met on that train platform months ago. A pistol gripped unsteadily in his hand, his clothes torn and filthy from days on the run. "There you are," Nathan said, and his voice had none of its old arrogant polish left in it, only something raw and desperate and dangerous. "The perfect little happy ending. Isn't that sweet, Nathan?" Ethan said, voice low and steady, despite the rifle he kept trained on the other man. "This ends now. Put the gun down. Ends now." Nathan laughed, a broken, humorless sound. "It already ended, Walker. You and your little bride made certain of that. My father's name ruined. My ranch gone. Facing a noose for sins that weren't even mine to answer for." His pistol wavered toward Clara, and her whole body went rigid with terror. "You want to know what's left for a man in my position? Nothing. So why shouldn't I make certain you two don't get to keep what you took from me?" "I never took anything from you," Clara said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the pistol pointed toward her, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "You left me on that platform, Nathan. You made that choice long before any of this began." "I made a mistake," Nathan snarled. "One mistake and it cost me everything." "It wasn't one mistake," Ethan said, stepping slightly forward, positioning his own body more fully between Nathan's unsteady aim and Clara. It was 15 years of your family's crimes finally catching up to you. Clara didn't do that to you, Nathan. Your own father did that the day he burned Thomas Hendricks's barn and forced a dying man's signature onto a stolen deed. You've spent your whole life standing on ground that was never rightfully yours, and you want to blame a woman for finally exposing it. Something in Nathan's face cracked at that, not remorse exactly, but something close to it, some fracture in the desperate rage that had carried him this far. It doesn't matter anymore, he said, voice shaking. None of it matters. I've got nothing left to lose. That's exactly why you need to put the gun down. Clara said, her voice softer now, though her heart still pounded violently in her chest. Because whatever happens in the next few moments, Nathan, it's the last choice you'll ever fully make for yourself. Don't let it be this. For one long, suspended moment, nobody moved. The distant roar of the barn fire crackled through the night outside, and somewhere in the yard, Clara could hear Ruiz's voice, shouting orders, utterly unaware of the standoff unfolding inside the house. Then Nathan's hand began to shake more violently, the pistol wavering his composure, what little remained of it finally beginning to crumble entirely. I just wanted... His voice broke. I just wanted to matter, to be more than my father's son, more than his money, more than the ranch he handed me. And instead, I destroyed everything trying to hold on to exactly the things I hated about him. Then stop now, Ethan said, voice gentling slightly despite the rifle still steady in his hands. Before it's the last mistake you ever get the chance to walk back from. Nathan stood there, gun still raised, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt and desperation on his face, and for one terrible, breathless moment, Clara genuinely did not know which way the moment would break. Then from behind him, the kitchen's back door burst open, and Ruiz's voice roared into the room. "Drop it, Cole!" Nathan spun, startled, and in that single instant of distraction, Ethan moved, closing the distance in 2 fast strides, knocking the pistol from Nathan's unsteady grip with the barrel of his own rifle, the weapon clattering harmlessly across the kitchen floor, as Nathan collapsed to his knees, all the fight finally completely drained out of him. "It's over," Ethan said, breathing hard, standing over the broken man who had once tried to destroy everything Ethan had built. "It's finally completely over, Nathan." Nathan didn't fight as Ruiz moving, despite his still healing shoulder secured his hands with a length of rope from the kitchen wall. He simply knelt there, sobbing all the cold arrogance that had once defined him, utterly stripped away, leaving behind only the broken remnants of a man who had spent his entire life building his identity on stolen ground and had finally catastrophically run out of ground to stand on. "The barn," Ethan asked urgently, turning to Ruiz. "Frank and Tommy got it contained," Ruiz said. "Lost the west wall, but the animals are safe and the fire's near out. We'll rebuild." His eyes moved to Nathan, kneeling defeated on the kitchen floor. "This one's done a lot worse damage than a barn wall, though." The marshals arrived before dawn, summoned by Tommy, riding hard for town, the moment the barn fire was contained, and Nathan Cole was led away in chains as the first gray light broke over the ranch. His head bowed, his silence total. A broken shadow of the cold, dismissive man who had once looked at Clara on a train platform and declared her not what he expected. Clara watched him go with a complicated tangle of emotions. Not forgiveness, not quite, but something adjacent to it. A recognition that the man being led away in chains was in the end simply the final casualty of his own family's long-buried sins. A man who had chosen again and again to build his life on cruelty rather than character, and had finally paid the complete and total price for every one of those choices. "You're safe," Ethan said, pulling her close as the marshal's wagon disappeared down the road carrying Nathan Cole toward whatever justice finally awaited him. "Clara, you're safe. It's really truly finished this time." "I know," Clara said, and felt the words settle deep, felt the last lingering thread of fear finally fully unwind from around her heart. It's finished. Around them, the ranch bore the visible scars of the night's violence. The scorched west wall of the barn, the trampled yard, the exhaustion etched plain across every face gathered there. But standing in the pale gray light of dawn, surrounded by the people who had fought so fiercely to protect her, protect each other, protect the fragile, hard-won life they'd built together, Clara felt something even stronger than relief. She felt for the first time in longer than she could remember entirely and completely safe. The weeks that followed the trial's final resolution brought a kind of peace to Walker Creek Ranch that Clara had once believed existed only in the letters she used to receive from Nathan Cole. Except this peace was real, built not on empty promises, but on the plain, steady truth of people who had proven through fire and danger, and every hard test that came before it, exactly who they were. Nathan Cole was convicted on all counts, the historical land fraud connected to his father's crimes against the Hendricks family, the conspiracy behind the fence-cutting and intimidation campaign against Walker Creek Ranch, and the attempted violence that had wounded Ruiz and nearly cost far more. He was sentenced to a lengthy term in the territorial prison, his family's remaining assets seized, and in a decision Clara found she could not entirely regret. A portion of the recovered land ordered returned to whatever surviving Hendricks relatives could be located, a small, imperfect measure of justice arriving 15 years later than it should have. Silas Grant, having cooperated fully with the investigation, received a reduced sentence, though Clara knew Ethan harbored little sympathy for the man who had pulled the trigger that wounded Ruiz, regardless of whose orders he'd been following. But the trials, the sentences, the slow unwinding of 15 years of buried crime, all of it faded in time into simply the difficult history that had led Clara and Ethan to this particular hard-won present. A present neither of them intended to spend one more moment mourning what it had cost to arrive at. The wedding took place on a warm afternoon in early autumn in the yard of Walker Creek Ranch itself, the rebuilt barn standing sturdy and whole behind them, a small gathering of townsfolk and neighbors who had, in the months since the trial, come to know Clara not as the mail-order bride abandoned at the station, but as a woman who had helped expose 15 years of buried injustice and stood fierce and unflinching against real mortal danger to do it. "You look beautiful," Ethan said, when Clara appeared in a simple pale dress she'd made herself no finery. Nothing like what Nathan Cole might once have offered her. And somehow standing there in the golden autumn light, it was more beautiful to her than anything she could have imagined wearing on that terrible first day. "You look nervous," Clara said, teasing gently, though her own heart pounded with matching, joyful anticipation. "I am," Ethan admitted, taking her hands in his. "Man waits his whole life for something like this. Doesn't make the moment itself any less overwhelming." Ruiz fully healed. Now, save for a stiffness in his shoulder, he grumbled about on cold mornings, stood as Ethan's witness, beaming with unabashed pride. Frank had somehow talked himself into a proper suit, sweating through the unfamiliar formality with good-natured complaints. Tommy sat beside the girl from town. He'd finally, after months of shy hesitation, worked up the courage to court both of them, grinning through the entire ceremony. The preacher's words washed over Clara like something out of a dream. She'd once been afraid to let herself have promises of partnership, of honesty, of building a life together through whatever came, promises that felt. This time, nothing at all like the empty, self-serving letters that had once brought her 3,000 miles across the country to be discarded on a train platform. "Do you, Ethan Walker, take this woman?" "I do," Ethan said, before the preacher had even finished, his voice thick with emotion, and the small gathered crowd laughed warmly at his eagerness. "And do you, Clara Whitmore, take this man?" "I do," Clara said, and the words came out clear and certain, and utterly without hesitation, carrying within them every hard mile of the journey that had brought her here. The humiliation of that first terrible evening, the fear of Nathan Cole's cruelty and violence, and beneath all of it, the slow, steady discovery of a home and a love she had once believed simply wasn't meant for a woman like her. When Ethan kissed her, the small crowd erupted into cheers, and Clara felt in that single perfect moment every broken piece of the woman who had once stood alone on that platform, finally, completely made whole. Years passed as years do, and Walker Creek Ranch grew steadily, under Clara and Ethan's shared hands. New fences, a larger herd, a rebuilt barn standing stronger than the one that had burned, and eventually the joyful chaos of two children whose laughter filled the house in a way that made even Ruiz Gray now, and finally slowed by age, admit that the place had never felt more like a true home. Clara became known throughout the growing town, not merely as Ethan Walker's wife, but as a woman in her own right. Someone newcomers to the territory sought out for guidance. Someone struggling families knew they could turn to without judgment. Someone who understood better than most exactly what it felt like to arrive somewhere with nothing and be shown against all expectation genuine kindness instead of cruelty. "You've built something remarkable here," Hargrove said once, visiting the ranch years after the trial that had first brought him into their lives, watching Clara manage both a bustling household and a growing herd with the same steady competence she'd once brought to organizing legal documents in a desperate fight for survival. "We built it," Clara corrected gently. "All of us. Ethan Ruiz, Frank Tommy. Nobody builds something worth having entirely alone." It was an evening much like countless others by then. The sun sinking low and golden over the mountains that had watched over Walker Creek Ranch through every hardship and triumph, when Clara found herself standing on the same porch where Ethan had once knelt to ask her to marry him. Watching their children chase each other across the yard, while Ethan worked nearby mending a fence with the same steady, patient hands that had once carried her suitcase away from a train station where an entire town had watched her be discarded. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Ethan asked, coming to stand beside her, following her gaze out toward the darkening horizon. "Sometimes," Clara admitted. "Not with sadness anymore, though. More like gratitude, strange as that sounds. If Nathan Cole had simply kept his word that day, I'd never have found any of this." "Strange thing to be grateful to a man like that for," Ethan said. "Not grateful to him," Clara clarified. "Grateful for what came after. For you, for this life we built out of the wreckage of what he threw away." She turned to face him fully, the same steady warmth in his gray eyes that had first drawn her trust on that terrible, desperate evening years ago. "I came here believing I was searching for a husband, Ethan, someone practical, someone who would simply give me a roof and a purpose. What did you find instead?" Ethan asked, echoing a question that had in some form lived between them since almost the very beginning. Clara looked out at the ranch they had built together, the rebuilt barn, the children's laughter carrying on the evening breeze. The mountains standing eternal and unchanged around the home that had grown from nothing but honest work and unshakable devotion into something that would outlast them both. "I found someone who chose me," she said. "Not because he needed help running his household, not out of pity for a woman abandoned on a platform. He chose me because he saw exactly who I was in every hard and unpolished piece of me, and decided that person was worth building a whole life around." Ethan pulled her close, resting his chin against the top of her head the way he had 1,000 times before in danger and in peace alike, and Clara felt the full complete weight of everything they had survived together settle into something that no longer felt like scars, but simply like the foundation of everything good that had come after. "I'd choose you again," Ethan said quietly. "Every single day, exactly the same way, no matter what stood between us." "I know," Clara said, and smiled against his chest, certain of it in a way she had never once been certain of anything in her whole difficult, hard-won life. "I know you would." And that was the story people in that Wyoming territory told for years afterward, not the story of a woman who had been abandoned and pitied, but the story of a woman who had survived cruelty, fought fraud and violence with nothing but her own courage and conviction, and found at the end of it all a love built not on convenience or appearance, but on the simple, unshakable truth of two people who saw each other clearly and chose one another anyway. Because the greatest love was never the one that arrived easily wrapped in empty promises and polished letters. The greatest love was the one built in the fire of real hardship, proven through every danger and every doubt, standing unbroken at the end of it. And Clara Whitmore Walker knew beyond any shadow of question that she had found exactly that and would keep it whole and unshaken for every single day of the life still waiting ahead of her.